Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the OWASP DevSlop Show. Today, we're going to talk to Jeff Williams about creating fantastic and compelling vulnerability write-ups to concisely explain the risk of the vulnerabilities you find, compel the receivers of these write-ups to take action. I'm Nikki, and I'm joined by my co-host, Shanisa. If you can't stick with us until the end, don't worry. The recording will remain available on our channel. Links to everything we covered today will be down below. Make sure to give us a thumbs up and subscribe. Hi, Shanisa.
Hello, everybody. So as Nikki mentioned, we have Jeff Williams today. He is the CTO of Contrast Security, and he has done a lot for the OWASP community in general. So he has been a major founder and contributor to OWASP. He served as global chairman for 10 years and created the OWASP Top 10. Over to you, Jeff, for vulnerabilities.
Thanks, y'all. Good morning, everyone. So today we're going to talk to a topic that is near and dear to my heart. It's not the most exciting topic in application security, but it is so critical. We're going to talk about how to vulnerability. So let's jump into it. I apologize for this. You are probably great at testing applications, finding vulnerabilities, running scanners, using tools, but unfortunately, it's very likely that you also suck at explaining risks. And I say that lovingly. I've worked with hundreds of consultants, brilliant people over 20 years on helping them explain the brilliant things that they've found. And it takes practice, it takes some work, but you got to understand, it is your job to not just find these risks, but also explain them in a way that people will believe them, understand the details of those risks, and take action. And really, it's that last piece we're going to focus on a lot. We really want people to take action and fix vulnerabilities, because it does no good to just pile up a big pile of cool vulnerabilities in a corner somewhere and nobody fixes them. So, by the way, this is Richard Feynman. He's one of my heroes. He's a Nobel Prize winning physicist, and he is not only a brilliant researcher, but he's also one of the best explainers ever. And if you ever get to listen to his lectures on physics, you'll understand he tries not to use jargon. He brings things down to a very understandable level using real world examples. This is the model for how we should explain risk. Okay, so I want to take a minute and just talk about why this is so important. It's your job is really not just to find these vulnerabilities. It's also to help organizations get better at producing secure code. And I want you to, see the whole chessboard here. You're shooting for an organization that has a culture of security. And look, this isn't a DevSecOps talk, but it's really important that security and development teams and operations teams, for that matter, work together. Security never gets accomplished in an organization where there's blame and fighting and friction between development and security. And it's dumb, because really, we're all on the same team. We're all trying to build great software that's safe for customers to use and get it into production. So you have to find a way to work together with the development teams. I'll give you a quick story about being compelling. One of my law school professors, I took a job with them doing some research, and we would argue about stuff back and forth. And I had an idea, and I said, but I'm right. And he goes, well, who cares about being right? And I thought, what are you talking about? That's the only thing is being right. And he said, no, you go over in a corner, Jeff, and you be right. I'm going to be over here figuring out how to be compelling. And he changed the way I thought about my job and writing and communicating. It's really all about being compelling. If you're not compelling, it doesn't matter. So look, I get it. It's hard to find vulnerabilities. And it's very hard to both find vulnerabilities and then establish trust, clearly and concisely explain risks, being compelling. all while being great to work with and without bruising any egos. But I'm sorry, that's the job. It doesn't work if you're authoritarian style security person who's ordering people around and failing builds and over exaggerating risks. You have to be great to work with. And if you're not, you can undermine the whole security program and culture, which is, as we said in the intro, that's the whole point of what we're doing here in the first place. We're trying to get great at building secure software. So,
hey, Jeff,
yeah,
really quick, just on that like self-reflection idea. Let's just say you are that authoritative security person, or you have tendencies to kind of go in that direction. I don't know. What could you look for to like identify that this is a behavioral pattern you have and kind of slowly or quickly correct it? I'm sure you've met dozens of these people.
Yeah, it's really tricky. I get in arguments on LinkedIn all the time. Like I just had one with a guy who said, he's a CISO actually, and he said, I have a 3 strikes and you're out rule. If you make vulnerabilities, you're going to be fired. And I was just like, wow, talk about the opposite of trust and empathy. I think it's important to look out for things like hiding of vulnerability information, people that aren't sharing information as well as they should. I think you can sort of sense a culture of fear in organizations, and there's this weird feedback loop where if security is blaming, then development will have fear and hiding, and that leads to less transparency, and actually then the security team has to get more authoritarian in order to get the information they need, and it's just this doom cycle. And so I think the key to breaking that out is to really think about how you build trust and empathy with organizations. And things like this, every time you blast out a raging email about something, with a ton of jargon in it that doesn't really explain the risk, people, honestly, they won't take you seriously. You might be absolutely right, but they won't take you seriously because, you're not explaining the story the right way. And that's really what this talk is all about. One thing you might take a look at if you get a chance is a guy named Larry Macharone, who used to run the DevSecOps transformation program at Comcast, talks a lot about his trust algorithm. And it's a way of thinking about building trust between development teams and the security group. He actually goes to them with a pledge. He says, we understand that you're in a better position to make decisions about a lot of risks than security. Okay, so another quick point on respect. I really want people to understand that your audience for your vulnerabilities are tremendously smart, very technical, and they live in a totally different world than you if you're just an AppSec specialist. They may not have any experience with security, but it's not their fault. And so you can't be judgmental about it. It's actually incredibly hard to be a great developer. The amount of things that they have to learn and keep up with, new frameworks, new technologies, Amazon's rolling out some new cloud service every day. So it really is astounding. And so, if you don't know things like how to convert an anonymous method to a Lambda expression, or when to use a streaming XML parser instead of a DOM parser, then you should find a little bit of humility if they don't know what CSRF is. So I like to think every risk is a story, and it's got a logical flow to it. There's an exposition. There might be a happy ending at the end. Every vulnerability is awesome if you tell it right. And the good thing is the story is the same every time. It doesn't matter if you're writing it in a report or talking to a developer one-on-one about it, or if you're presenting it to the board of directors. You have to tell the whole story. You can't skip steps. I'm going to emphasize that a bunch of times today. Is you just can't skip steps. At the same time, this isn't Shakespeare. I'm going to try to give you a recipe that will help you communicate any vulnerability effectively. And not just application security vulnerabilities, but almost any vulnerability, if you want to maintain that trust. You can do it in less than 5 minutes if you focus and learn and practice. And it's a great skill to learn, because the less time you waste writing things up, the more time you can spend doing the cool stuff that you love. So I want to try to make this super easy for you. Of course, you have to really understand the vulnerability first. That's not what this paper's about. But when I mean really understand it, I mean you really got to understand it, soup to nuts. So let's dig into this. We're going to follow these steps to explain a vulnerability. And like, I always do a couple things when I'm trying to think of how to explain it. I think about explaining it to my mom. She's in her 70s. She's not very technical. Like, she has trouble using Zoom. But that's my model for who to explain it to. And she's never going to understand, all the software components and things like that. But I try to keep the language really simple to make sure that my audience can understand this. I also try to use the word "we" a lot. It's just so much. It's a little thing, but it's so important to say, to communicate the fact that you're on the same team as the developers. So you say, we have a vulnerability, and here's how our software works. That can go a long way towards just making them feel like you're on their team. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to explain how the application works, build some trust. We're going to talk about how it can be abused. We'll go through the risk factors. We're going to give a realistic scenario so they really understand it, and explain the fix. And then we're going to go back to the beginning, and we're going to create a compelling title. I always do this last because you really don't understand what the title should be until you do these other steps. And again, you can't skip steps. And I swear to God, every one of you is, I've done this with hundreds of consultants. Every one of you is going to want to jump to right into the middle of step 2 and start talking about how to exploit it. Don't do that. Don't be that person. It doesn't work unless you set this up correctly. So let's jump into this. So the first thing that you need to do is explain to them how the app works. Now, they're the developers, so they probably already know how the app works. Actually, in a lot of cases, that may not be true, depending on who you're talking to. But by telling them how their own application works, you're building trust. This is kind of how I think about introducing the main characters of your story, right? You spend a little time at the beginning of the movie and you're talking about, what the application is, what it does, how the input flows from the, the rich API client into the API code, and, where it goes on the back end. You're not talking about security here. You're just talking about how the pieces of their application fit together. And it only takes a couple of sentences, a minute or two, but you're really building trust. If you tell them back that, then they know that you're invested in understanding what their thing does. Then,
and Jeff, quick question on number 1. So do you ever find that it's maybe necessary to explain the business context of the app, depending on your audience that you're sharing this with?
Yeah, depending on the audience, I usually wait, because we're going to talk about that when we talk about the risk. And often the folks that you're talking to will understand the business context way better than you. It does help to mention, a little bit if you think that that there's someone in the room that really doesn't understand that this application processes trillions of dollars a day or something. You can set the context a little bit early, sure. The second step here is kind of how you have that plot twist, right? All of a sudden, you had their heads nodding. They're like, yeah, this guy understands our application. By the way, actually, a really good thing to do in step 1 is to find something to complement in their application. It doesn't really matter what it is, but, reflect on how beautiful their UI is, or, how modern it is, or their use of modern app services or something. It will help just build that trust again. Then there's this plot twist, right? Now, all of a sudden, their heads were nodding, and then you go, yeah, but here's the problem. in this case, this data is flowing through the application into this native command, and it's not getting validated in any way. So here's where you're going to stick to, like, really step by step how this vulnerability works. There shouldn't be any assumptions or exaggeration or characterization of the vulnerability. You're not saying, hey, this is really bad, or this is dumb, or anything like that. You're sticking to the facts, because then it's just a team of people looking at a potential problem, and they'll get that. But you really want to focus on trying to get that blameless culture here. And I always try to get them to have that aha moment. I don't know if you've ever trained anybody in AppSec. The moment they get how some vulnerability works, generally developers love that. They're like, oh, that's cool. I see how that works. Look, the SQL syntax there flows right into the query and modifies the meaning of the query. Great. Or, oh, I didn't know that the XML doc type header gets processed and can do all these weird things like include files and so on. And they get it. So that's what you're shooting for here, is like, you got a great application, but it's got this way it can be abused. So once you explain that, and then again, that's a step-by-step, here's what happens inside the application that we explained in step one. The next thing is to say, okay, now here are the risk factors. And this is where you really want to get into both the technical aspects and the business aspects of the risk. And this is really trying to answer the question, so what? And I strongly encourage you to ask yourself that every time you find a vulnerability. There's a lot of vulnerabilities that get reported that really don't have a lot of so what to them. If you found SQL injection in an admin page and that admin already has control of the database, it doesn't matter, right? You ask yourself, so what? Well, it's only the admin that can do this. So I want you to work through the factors here. And in the article that this talk is based on, by the way, this whole talk is detailed out in a long article on LinkedIn that I'm sure will be in the show notes or something. There's details on how to think about understanding both the likelihood that an attacker will find and exploit this vulnerability, and the technical and business aspect of thinking about all the possible impacts of this attack. And there can be many, by the way. There's not always just one impact. If someone breaks in and maybe it's a expression language injection flaw like the one that Atlasian just had in Confluence, there's a number of things that an attacker could have done with that, right? They could start a reverse shell and start stealing information, but they could also corrupt things. They could launch attacks on other systems. You have to think about all the possible outcomes of a particular vulnerability and all the different attackers. You want to kind of iterate through them. Is it an anonymous internet attacker, or is it an insider? Is it a customer? Is it an admin? There's various roles that can all make a difference. And you have to choose here a little bit, like, how are you going to describe this risk? And I usually try to focus on, the risk that's the most plausible. What could really happen? What's got the worst impacts? And then capture it for folks in a way that they can understand.
Would you use CVSS scores here to help explain, or is that like the lazy way?
It's useful to go through the CVSS factors, because they'll have you, think about things like, is this accessible from the internet? Is it something that a tool could automate? What are the impacts in terms of confidentiality and integrity and availability and so on? But really, what you're going to find is, in almost all cases, is that there's a few of those factors. And I think there's, 8 or there's a ton of factors. And OWASP risk rating methodology is the same way. There's a bunch of factors, but what you'll find in practice is that only a few of them really are moving the needle. And so these mechanical, elaborations of all of these different risk areas doesn't really help very much. what I suggest you do is focus on the things that move the needle. Like, hey, this is something that's, it's unauthenticated, and there are public exploits out there for this. And in fact, there are tools that will automatically scan the internet for this vulnerability. So your likelihood is through the roof. Those are the kinds of descriptions that I think really compel behavior. And really ask yourself, so what? I want you to put yourself in the application owner's seat when you do this. And I love this 5 whys exercise. If you haven't done this, like, it's like having a 3-year-old in the room going like, well, why? And ask yourself, why is this important? And your first answer might be like, well, because the attacker can modify a SQL query. And then you're like, okay, so well, why does that matter? And keep bubbling, then you can ask yourself about like, well, what data are we talking about that they could steal really? Oh, well, it's only the lunchroom cafeteria menu. So oops, it doesn't matter. And that's what you're going to find. Things like the OWASP top 10 are fine, but the risk related to a SQL injection is not always high or critical or whatever it is, whatever your tool tells you it is. It's not. Sometimes it's nothing. And sometimes it's the end of the world. And it's your job to figure out, like, does it really matter? And I try to put myself in the seat of the application owner, like, who's the business owner for this app? And do they really care? Like, if my app got blown off the face of the planet, would the business owner care? Maybe not. Maybe it's just they got to, restore it from backup or something. So it's really important to understand that. And in order to do that, you have to talk with the people on the team. And I would say you need to communicate vulnerabilities with folks on the development team pretty much as soon as you find them. Nobody wants to be surprised. I'll say a little more about that. But, as you're getting into this, it's not a bad idea to talk to them. And, you'll still have to tell the story in the right order when you explain it to them. You can't just call them up and jump right in the middle of step 2. You're still going to have to set it up. But you need to find out, like, do they care? Does it matter? They'll know better than you.
Hey, Jeff, really quick, we just have a couple of questions in the chat.
Oh, yeah, sure.
That I'm just going to drop in with. So it's really around, I think, what we were discussing earlier, if you might tend to be more authoritarian around your communication.
Yeah.
If you're under a lot of stress, maybe you kind of default to that sort of more snappy behavior.
Yeah.
What could you do? Like, what tools are in that shed that you can use to help manage that? Or to just like remind yourself, like, this isn't the right thing.
Yeah, I don't know. I get that way sometimes with my kids, right? Like, you can't let yourself get that way. Really, this framework is a way to avoid doing that, right? Like, don't let yourself jump right into the middle of step 2 and start, using jargon that they don't understand. Make sure you get in the habit of explaining vulnerabilities this way. And there's a lot of slides here, but really each one of these steps is like 1 or 2 sentences when you really get down to it. And so we've tried to break it down really very fine, but it's not like you have to write a novel here. It's really quite fast to just tell this story the right way. And you'll have a much shorter conversation with whoever you're having a conversation with if you do it this way than if you start in the middle and then people start asking all kinds of questions and people get upset because you're blaming them. This is if you don't like doing this, then this is definitely the way to do it.
Yeah, totally. Or think about really simple things, right? Like sometimes it's really, if you think about trying to explain, why do I need to use MFA, right? That's a very sort of kind of simpler explanation than maybe walking through a full vulnerability report, just to get yourself in the habit of, like, I don't know, empathetic communication around an area that people might not be as expert in as you are. I don't know. It's worked for me in the past.
It takes a lot of practice to do this. And look, so I used to train my consultants to do this because that's what makes them great. And many of them, by the way, have gone on to be CISOs and really highly regarded security researchers and running companies of their own and so on. So I'm really confident in this method, but it does take practice. And you'd tell them, you'd remind them, you'd train them, and then sure enough, when they get in front of the customer and they say, well, the briefing of vulnerability, they jump right in the middle and start talking about the exploit. And it takes practice and discipline to do this. I encourage you to practice all the time. Like if you find a new vulnerability, explain it to your peers, explain it to your mom, explain it, like just to practice explaining it, and you'll get good at it. So here, we're almost done, actually. We're on step 4.
Well, Jeff, before we
ahead.
move on, so real quick, we do have a question from One Tall Girl. Going back to step 1. So in that step, is someone doing a pen test? Are they looking at scan results? Is this a collaborative effort?
I think the answer is yes. It's really anytime you have to communicate a vulnerability with folks that need to know about it. So, tool results are fine, but some tools don't give a huge amount of detail about things. And so you may have to do a little more research to sort of fill in the gaps and, make sure it's exploitable and things like that. That's really about understanding the vulnerability. You got to do that first before you try to communicate it. Otherwise, you're going to get yourself all messed up. Imagine you see a report of, I don't know, what's a good one? Unsafe deserialization in an application from a tool, and you're like, well, I don't really understand that vulnerability, or I don't know how it works. And then you try to communicate it. People are going to have questions, and they're going to challenge you, and you're going to lose all your credibility if you don't really understand it. But this really is for about any scenario where you're communicating a vulnerability, whether it's from a tool or from pen testing or from a threat modeling exercise. It's really all the same thing. Okay, so the 4th step is create a realistic attack scenario. And really, this is, I think, one of the most fun things. This is like when you get to the point in the story when you want to actually detail the heist. Right? Like this is your Ocean's 11 moment. And you got to pick one. There could be lots of different scenarios, but I just encourage you to pick one that you think's likely to happen. It's you want to consider the worst case scenario, but often the worst case is less likely. So you want to pick one that's could reasonably happen and has some serious impact. And, talk through about what the attacker might do and what the technical impact of that's going to be, and then what the business impact of that is going to be. It just makes it real. The executive who's been kind of, half listening as you explain the technical stuff, you want to get them to tune in here and go hey, your business could be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal tomorrow because, this is really embarrassing stuff. That's when, and I should say, our application is going to be on the front page of the Wall Street Journal tomorrow. You get to tell that story, and that's a lot of fun. Think of what data they could steal, what would really make a difference. The last step is as we're winding this story up. This is the Princess Bride happy ending moment here. You can explain options to fixing it, and hopefully, if you've been working with the team, the development team on this, you've already explained this to the developers. They, maybe they've even made the fix already. And there's nothing better than doing a readout on your pen test or something and telling the execs, hey, you had this really serious vulnerability, but we've been working with the team all along and they've already put a fix into production for this. Then they're like, wow, great. You don't want to leave them with things to worry about. You don't want to create homework for them. I hate to use this analogy, but if any of you have kids and your kid's really proud when they first go to the bathroom on their own and they want to show it to you. Well, that's like when you do a pen test and you find some really important things, you really want to show it off. But actually what you're doing is you're delivering a turd to the development teams and they have to deal with it. And you're creating work for them. So to the extent you can make it better by saying, hey, you know what? It's a bad vulnerability, but it's really not that bad to fix, or you already fixed it. That's really powerful. And you want to present alternatives here. There's not just one way to fix a vulnerability. there are compensating controls. There's different strategies depending on whether this application is going to be around for a long time. Like maybe they're decommissioning it in a year. Okay, well, we don't want to rewrite the whole thing. We're gonna paste over this vulnerability a little bit. You have to think about how you would really fix this. If it were your app, what would you really do? It's easy to say like, oh, well, just rewrite all your queries using prepared statements. Well, okay, that's ideal, but it may not be practical. So this is where you get to tie everything together and bring the story home. Then the last thing is go back to the beginning and create a compelling title. And this is more important than you'd think. Many execs don't really get past the titles. And if your titles are not really interesting or compelling, or they're over technical, you're going to lose your crowd. Nobody's going to read your vulnerabilities, and that's undermining what you were trying to do in the first place. I always start with this formula: who can do what and how. And the who is the attacker. You want to choose the attacker that's most likely here. If it's an anonymous internet attacker, okay, great. If it's an insider, detail that out. Maybe it's a user of the application. And then can do what is about the impact, like what bad happens if someone attacks this application and exploits it. And then the how is a little bit about how someone would go about exploiting it. And you don't want to go into huge details here, but giving a hint about this is interesting. And this is not the only way to generate it. All your titles don't have to be like rigidly following this formula, but what you do want is like a newspaper headline that someone will read. I'm not saying make them clickbait, but a little bit clickbait so that they'll open this up and understand what's going on here. You got to make it interesting. So I picked a few. If you remember the Struts 128 expression language injection that was a major breach about a few years ago. Imagine these following titles. You can see, if you just list a CVE, nobody understands what that is. If you say it's OGL injection in Struts, well, I don't know. I mean, that's technically true, but it doesn't tell me who or what's bad about this for me. You could say it's a Struts RCE in a content type header. Well, your readers may not know what either of those things are. I like the fourth one. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, so someone in the chat, we have a comment, maybe a question. For unusual vulnerability reports to devs, would you prefer to make a video or a POC to document it? So in this example, would you want to make a video? Like, does that help in your experience?
It can, although often those videos are over in 1 second, right? Like this one in particular, your video would be like, hey, I set up this super ass complicated HTTP request and I hit send, and then boop, I've got a command shell.
Right.
And it doesn't really explain what's going on. So I encourage caution there. You can't do that just by itself. And the video doesn't take the place of the whole story that we just spent our time explaining. It's actually kind of a good, visual aid, or like a wrap up after you've explained it here, and I can show it to you, and then they'll understand what they're seeing. But to just show one of those videos, it's really hard to figure out what's going on, particularly with like hard exploits like unsafe deserialization or expression language injection. Like they're not going to understand what's in that exploit. I mean, if you've seen this exploit, it's like 20 lines of kind of obfuscated Java code in expression language format. It's not, you're not going to walk through that with most readers.
Yeah, totally agree.
So anyway, I thought like the last one can work too. It's a little less detailed. It's actually kind of raising it up a level. It's putting the blame on the version of the Struts framework, and that's fine. It's actually more focused on the fix than the vulnerability itself, which is definitely okay, particularly if it's like an unsafe library, like maybe that's all you need to say is like, hey, this bad stuff can happen because you have this unsafe library, and that's enough to get somebody to do the read. So a couple practical tips, and then I'll wrap up. So I strongly encourage you to write up things as you go. So I see so many consultants do this. They're testing and they're in the heat of the testing and they don't want to, like get out of their flow and write down a vulnerability. But it's really dangerous, because what you'll do is let's say you got 40 hours to do a pen test, and you'll run your tools, you start finding stuff and you're making notes, and then you decide, well, I'll just write these up at the end. But then by the time you get around to that, you've used up all your time, and you have to work the whole weekend to write up all the findings. And actually, it's really hard in some cases. You'll have to retest stuff because you didn't really capture everything you needed to do the writing when you were doing it. So I strongly encourage you, just for the sanity of your life, just write things up as you go. Hey, that's a command injection. Let's write that up. Take 5 minutes, knock it out. And then when you're done testing, you're done writing. It's a great feeling. I also encourage you to avoid boilerplate. As I mentioned before, every vulnerability is different. The risk is different. So don't just grab the same text from the old report. Really, write it up custom. It's faster and easier, and everyone will appreciate it more. It's not a race to find the most vulnerabilities. So you might find a ton of, I don't know, log injection or bad caching headers or something. Just merge them together. Write them up as one risk. If there's basically one remediation, don't write 10 vulnerabilities. Just write one and say, hey, this is in these 10 locations, or collapse them in some way. And Jeff, never surprise people with risks. I mentioned this before, but it's worth repeating. You want to make sure that people know about it, and you're never walking into a meeting with executives and briefing them on vulnerabilities that their team doesn't know about or that they haven't heard about. You really want them to, have no surprises. I'll say it again. Don't hurtle.
Jeff, quick question on one of your bullet points there.
I'm sorry?
Quick question on one of your points there about the single remediation. So I recently heard from a professor, I believe at Capital Technology University, Dr. Nikki Robinson, I believe. And she mentioned about this concept of vulnerability chaining, blindness, so that you may have multiple low risk vulnerabilities, but bringing those together produces a high risk. So what are your thoughts around that and how you present remediation there?
Yeah, I think that you have to think about the risk, really. And if there's multiple vulnerabilities that combine to create a risk, you should absolutely combine those into a single story. Nobody really cares much about low risks. So it doesn't, you're not moving the needle. If they've got high risks, they want to focus on fixing those first. So these are hard to discover, though. Taking advantage of a low vulnerability to get some amount of access, and then exploiting another vulnerability, like SSRF might be a good example. It's already kind of a high risk, but if you can use the SSRF to access a backend system and cause some terrible damage, that's really interesting. That dramatically increases the impact of that vulnerability. But for me, it's about writing up the most important risk. Like, what is going to get people in the organization to actually fix that stuff? It's going to be the best story. So if it's a chained vulnerability, write up the chain. That's going to get them to take it seriously.
Thank you.
And you need practice. I've said this before. It's critical. I can't explain enough that your instinct is going to pull you to where you're most comfortable, to talking about the details of that vulnerability. And you're going to start talking about, parameter names and XML formats and stuff. And you're going to be less compelling. You really want to go through all the steps of this and just get in the habit. Start with how the application works. And, they say if you're going to, engage on a fitness program, really you should just focus on, taking the first few steps, like get yourself out the door. Doesn't matter how far you run, just take the first few steps. Here, the thing is, start by explaining how the application works. Don't let yourself skip that step. And then the good things will follow if you can explain how the application works. So with that, I'll stop. Hopefully this was useful to you. There is a detailed article on LinkedIn. I've got a few other articles there on pen testing and building AppSec programs in a software factory and things like that. But if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to me on LinkedIn, or I can try to answer them right now.
So
go ahead, Shanisa. Sorry.
Yeah. We do have one more question from Rich Musicfy, I think it is. How do you apply this concept when your devs have SAS tools? And so they're reading, I guess, remediation steps from their SAS tools. And how do you combine both that concept with what you're speaking about?
Yeah. Well, unfortunately, SAS tools they're a bit of a tool for security researchers, right? Like they do produce, I'd say, partial findings, right? They find things that might be vulnerable, might be exploitable. They generate a lot of false alarms. So they don't have the whole story in them. So someone needs to fill in the whole story. If you want people to take them seriously, then, you can do it as part of your security team, or you can send those off to development teams and let them try to wrestle with it. I don't know, people talk about shifting left. I think if you're taking tools designed for security researchers and push them onto development teams, that's really shitting left. They don't have the skills to deal with those things. So sorry about that, but that's what I'd like people to avoid doing is, output of SAS tools is not really developer friendly. IaaS tools, on the other hand, much more context.
Now, would you ever recommend linking to that content that came from the SAS tool? So you're doing your own write-up, according to the formula that you've outlined, and then maybe linking to that SAS tool result.
Sure. And it doesn't, if there's detail there that really helps, mostly it's going to be like, hey, the input came from this line of code and it landed in the method in this line of code. That's always useful context. But really, they're missing a lot of the story, right? SAS tools don't have details about what libraries and frameworks are being used, what the actual HTTP request is. That's a critical piece of the story, is where did that come from? Backend connections, configuration files, there's a lot of pieces of the story that are kind of missing. And so, it's a good starting point, but you got to do the research to fill in those gaps.
Yeah, I agree. That context is missing in a lot of those SAS tools. So it's hard to, and you have to manually add it. And sometimes when you're dealing with a code base that's really long, you could spend a long time manually adding context on every sort of SAS finding.
Oh my gosh.
Then validating them. And
that's really, to me, that's part of finding the vulnerability, confirming the vulnerability, right? It's right. Understanding the vulnerability. You don't start writing it up until you've confirmed it, right? And you understand right. it. Then you have the context, and you can, then you can write it up really easily once you've confirmed it.
Yeah.
That's actually why I focused on IaaS tools so hard, is IaaS tools run from inside the application. So they've got a lot more context. They can tell a much richer story.
And for those that aren't familiar with the IaaS term, can you just 2 seconds that?
Yeah, sure. IaaS is interactive application security testing. And all that means is that you're using instrumentation to measure an application from the inside. So just like a tool like New Relic or App Dynamics would measure performance as you're doing your normal testing and so on, IaaS tools measure security while you're doing your normal development process. So it runs in the background, it's continuously on, and just does security testing from within the application. And the coolest thing about it is you don't have to exploit vulnerabilities in order to find them. It just uses normal input. So it kind of enables every developer to be a security tester and get all that context.
Yeah. Cool. I think we are out of questions in the chat. Let me just check. People are
Actually,
LOLing at
one
shitty
more.
left, but
Yeah, one more about teaching
Sorry about
defensive
that.
coding.
no, it's great. I think it needs a t-shirt.
So any thoughts on teaching defensive coding?
Yeah, actually, so I think it's really important, and you should know I spent 12 years teaching instructor-led application security courses. I've taught thousands of developers secure coding. I also wrote a e-learning product that was sold for, I don't know, 5 years or so. But my thought is that really those techniques are not very effective. They don't stick very well, because no matter what you do, the context, the course that you teach is not perfectly aligned with the technologies that the developers are using. Understand what I'm saying? Like if I teach XSS, I can teach that in a generic way, but I can't teach, oh, you're using Timeleaf and ISAPI and other frameworks and libraries. So I never end up teaching exactly the right stuff. That means that I'm asking the developers to translate the principles that I teach into practical guidance for their environment. And I don't think that happens that much. So it's the same thing with like security requirements documents and secure coding guidelines and all those kinds of things that we produce. They're too generic to be effective. And so I think the right way to teach developers is to give them instant feedback in the tools that they're already using on their application, their code, and explain to them like, hey, that was a SQL injection. Here's why. Give them the full story. And that instant feedback that's how developers learn other stuff, and it's how they should learn security. I did write an article on that, which is I thought, if you think about all the ways that we communicate findings to developers, there's like PDF reports and dashboards and developer IDE plugins and all this stuff, but they're all like not really the way developers normally work. And so I thought, if we could fail a test case based on security, like, hey, that test that you just ran, it violated some policy that we have. Like, I don't know, maybe you're not allowed to create native processes. Okay, well, that test case caused that to happen. So you should just fail it and say why, and then the developer can dig into it and fix it. But that's a very natural way to communicate that. So I wrote up an article on how you can make that happen. But that's cool. Kind of the reason I said it, that's kind of the best training you can give, is just-in-time training, right the way they expect it.
And all your articles are on your LinkedIn. You post them mostly on LinkedIn?
Yeah, I mean, there's articles all over the place, but the good ones are on LinkedIn.
Okay, all right. Just for people to follow them. All right, 2 more questions in the chat. I'm going to merge them together. Are there any open source IAST tools? And what is the difference between IAST and DAST?
Okay, let me answer the second one first. So DAST is really about bombarding an application with HTTP requests that have attacks in them. And so if you think about, like, maybe you have a zip code field on a form on a page, well, you want to test that zip code field. So you can send like a bunch of attacks to that zip code field, hundreds probably, to test to see if it's susceptible to, any kind of attacks. And you got to do that for every field on every page, on every, all the headers and cookies and parameters and URL and hidden fields and all that stuff. You test all of that. And the only context that you get back is like the HTTP response. So like your attack could have worked, but you don't get any signal that it worked back. And so you decide that it's like, you might just get a 200 response back, and you don't know. So it's difficult to attack, and it's difficult to decide whether an attack worked based on the attacks that you send. So IAST works very differently. IAST instruments the application. So basically, as the application starts up, we add sensors to it so we can watch the code as it runs. And by watching, all the steps of an application as it's running, you can see vulnerabilities as they happen. So for instance, like for SQL injection, you can see, here's the line of code where the parameter was read in, and you see the actual parameter. Here's how that query got built as the data flows through the code. And then, here's the query that's about to go to the database with the untrusted data in it. And the cool thing is you don't have to attack the application. You can just use it normally. So your normal test cases, your normal test procedures, whether they're manual or automated, all turn into security testing. So it really aligns security and development really closely, because now you're both working to make sure your tests have good coverage and that you're testing for security as well as part of that. It also scales really nicely because it's like distributed. Imagine all of your applications testing themselves in parallel, as opposed to having to go like one by one through your whole portfolio and scan each of them. So IAST and DAST do both work on a running application, but that's about where the similarity ends.
So we got another question, Jeff. So do you have any...
Just the other part of that real quick. Are there any open source IAST? And there is a project that I created called the Java Observability Toolkit. I'm speaking about it at LastCon in a week or so, a couple weeks. It's pretty exciting. It'll allow you to craft your own IAST sensors, put them in applications, measure whatever you want from inside an application. It's not strictly a security tool. It can be used for other purposes as well. It also allows you to create your own RASP rules and protect applications from being exploited in production using instrumentation. And I will be demonstrating a very simple rule in Java that will would have protected Atlasian from being exploited if they had put it in place. It's easy and powerful, and it's sort of a no-code environment. You just create YAML rules, and you can do some really cool stuff with it.
Cool. We just posted that in the chat, so found it.
Yeah, and a question from One Tall Girl. So the formula that you've outlined, do you have any resources that map that to particular security scenarios as examples?
No, that's a great idea. I often challenge people to take an existing vulnerability. Like whenever you hear about the next breach, challenge yourself to see if you can find the details. Like when Atlasian came out last week, it was, it's an expression language injection in Confluence. And so, I have to understand that for my job. So like I dug into it a little bit to try to figure out like, well, what is the attack here? Turns out it's really simple. It's like really like one parameter on one URL that you can add that has an expression in it. And it ended up, at first they thought it had to be authenticated, but then it turns out it can be done in an unauthenticated way. And so it's a kind of a one request complete host takeover, similar to the one I was talking about in the talk a little bit. But that's the best way to practice. Unfortunately, all of the thousands of vulnerabilities that I've found and written up over the years have all been for customers. So I don't have like a lot that are just I can share. Unfortunately, they're all done under contract.
Thank you. Well, like you said, it helps people get practice if they do it on their own. So.
Yeah. Happy to bounce them off me. I'll send them to my LinkedIn. I'll critique them.
Cool. I think we're out of questions. So any closing words here, Jeff?
I did see the one question from One Tall Girl, which is thoughts on using the term fix versus mitigation, and she's right. I actually didn't have room in the title of the slide. I think if you read the actual article, I think it says mitigation, because you can't always fix a vulnerability, but sometimes you can do things to massively reduce the risk. So it's probably a better word. Sorry. It really was just like mitigation. I was using a gigantic font for some reason, so I couldn't fit it in the title.
Cool. Any final thoughts? before we
No,
wrap?
thanks. This is great. I really appreciate the work you guys do. DevSlop is awesome. So keep it up.
Yeah, thanks for coming on the show and talking about this topic. It's a good topic for us to all be reminded of over and over again. So really appreciate it.
And now we have
It's
a
not the
formula.
sexiest thing in the world, but I do think it's really important for folks.
What's that phrase? It takes a lifetime to build trust and a day to kill the trust, something like that.
That's
It's
right.
kind of true here. Yeah. So
Yeah, for sure.
this
You
is,
can really trash relationships fast.
yeah. All
I like
right.
coming in as a consultant into organizations that were broken like that and try to rebuild the trust. Like I felt like I was wearing a referee shirt and I just come in and like, okay, well, let's get to the bottom of this. There are some vulnerabilities, but no, they're not the end of the world. And like, try to bring teams together.
Yeah. Cool. So we have some shows coming up. So on October 15th, we have a show with our Australia crew. Shukara Sharma and Vicky Lee from Shift Left will be on. And we have, I'm sorry, how to analyze code for vulnerabilities using Dorn. And then following that on 10/17, we have Jasmine Jackson demystifying mobile security with a COVID app on the show here. Cool. Well, thanks so much, Jeff. If you could just stick around after we outro, it'd be cool.
Sure.
Have a great day, everyone. See you guys next time.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.